My background was started in applied experimental psychology. That's one of the worlds that can train you in human factors. We'll talk a little bit more about those. But I went to Catholic U in D.C., and it was just about the time when the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident happened, and the NRC said, boy, you know, we realize we need human factors folks to help us to look at these control rooms and how this designs are coming together, how they're failing us, the use of computers, teamwork, and all those many issues. So we were required, or nuclear power plants were required to have human factors reviews and to use our capabilities to help make them safer. After that, I worked in the DoD for about 17 years doing simulation and other types of weaponry projects. And then I worked in the computer world for websites. When websites first came out, they're so difficult to use. I ended up helping many of the organizations like the FAA, Library of Congress, and commercial clients like Verizon to improve their websites so people could actually perform what they tried to do when they went to their websites. And then I got the opportunity to work at Hopkins since 2007 because it was realized by that time that, again, this is another domain, this human factors domain that is useful in the world of medicine when there was realization from the 1999, was it? Yeah, the human error is medicine memorandum that we could use help from human factors people to help reduce risk. So that's the background for myself, and I'm glad to be here today. I am working presently for a company called Presensio, which is a very young company with 4 people. We have Scott Newton, who was the director of the emergency department at Hopkins, and Junaid Razak, who's a professor of medicine and emergency, and Christine Serio, another person who knows military medicine. And we're working on an app to help improve the emergency use of emergency calling and techniques, notification, things like that. So that's what we're up to lately. A young company, we can help with consultation if we can. So again, as they said, feel free to ask questions, and we'll start in with an introduction here. It says just, you know, what is human factors? So what is it? Why do we need it? I'll show some examples. What are the tools that we use? Important to you if you're going to design medical devices is the FDA guidance on medical devices and how to get it out into the world. What do we use as a basis for good human factors design? And finally, I'll provide some human factors resources if that's of interest to you. So what is human factors? It's when you think of this, think about the variables, the humans, the environment, tools, tasks, organizations, anything at all that really affects system performance. People in human factors come from psychology, from industrial engineering, biomechanics, mechanical engineering, and others. It's a bona fide discipline with their own. We have our own basis for scientific research, and we have our own professional society. It's more than common sense. If you, like all professions, it's really best if practiced by those who are trained in the field, although in many cases people fill their roles in human factors with people who are not trained, but the best thing to do is to work with those who are knowledgeable in the field. So as you can see here, I'm sorry for, you'll see some small print along the way, but there's a lot of ideas that I want to try to get across, so I'll explain as we go and see if I can, I'm in presentation mode, aren't I? No, I don't want to be, so I don't have my laser, sorry. So don't want to be for you guys. So anyway, you can see in this picture that we're talking about a work system, any work system, and the interaction of the person, the human, has with these different factors, the tech and tools, the tasks, the environment, the organization, any factor really at all, how that all comes together through a succession of interaction of elements and how it affects the process and outcome. That's the kind of big picture, if you will. So let's go next here. In the context of systems, a system, of course, is any group of elements that interacts for a purpose. And this slide just shows how many factors that they're involved. If you look at these 3 boxes, kind of like a stimulus, organism, and response kind of sequence, you can look at there in the environment box. There are so many things that can function as a stimulus that cause us to act. You know, it can be the environment, it can be the task, the tool itself. You know, we have our limitations and capabilities as humans, don't we? As our abilities to perceive the effects of stress and fatigue, the cognitive skills and biases, even the psychomotor skills, all of these things, they moderate those stimuli that come in as we're working in a process. And our outputs into that process will, in turn, of course, have an effect on the device that we're working with. The operating requirements, the interface design, all of these things result in another interaction with an output which starts the cycle over and over again. So if you want to make a system which is functioning highly well, you would want to really reduce the system into these many elements or interactions and see what you can do to improve the overall performance. So let's look at a couple examples. Why do we need human factors? This device, in lithotripsy, when you remove kidney stones from a kidney, a broken up kidney stone, this is kind of a vacuum type device which removes it. And you can see it's got a bottle there, and it's got a little pump with an arrow which gives you which direction you want to put the hose, okay, so that you get a vacuum effect. Well, it has happened in the past that that hose is put in incorrectly. So now what's happening, you're introducing fluid into the kidney, and that causes death, okay? So what we see here is a design which normally will work, but when there's high stress in the operating room, when somebody is switched because the nurse takes a break to get lunch, another nurse comes in, or a tech, same thing, can arrange this incorrectly and with very serious consequences. So we really would like to have a forcing function in this kind of case so that there's no way you could put this in incorrectly. Another example here is this is a infusion device, and it's what looks like a black panel there is a touch panel, and it's used to regulate how much saline or blood you're infusing into the patient. Now, as it comes from the factory, it doesn't have this little Lexan cover you see there. What happened was that when the bag is hung on this IV pole, the tube from the bag touched the touch screen and increased the rate of infusion to 500 milliliters per minute, which is very dangerous in this specific case condition. So we were asked by anesthesiology to help control that. Now there is a sensitivity control to that touch panel. However, the users prefer to be very light sensitivity. In an emergency, they don't want to have to be checking back to make sure every attempt to touch the panel and make a change did indeed happen. So we needed a way to protect it. So there's some very simple ways to, of course, to make corrections at times. But you can see that what we think is a very safe instrument can often produce some significant risks. Why do we need this? Human factors in the healthcare industry, well, you can see here, so it's $1.7 billion annually for the operating room errors that are related to device controls or devices. Many millions are spent in claims fees and defense fees, of course, because of these accidents. Something kind of behind the scenes, there's a lot of effort that goes into the engineering in the hospitals and the forensic analysis to identify equipment that is safe, and after the fact to do analyses and prepare for trials and things like this. There's a lot of costs associated with that, and not to mention the patient harm and suffering of second victims. So there are good, really very good reasons to let's go down one more. Did I? No, I'm there. Very good reasons to help to get the benefit from human factors. One of the really big challenges is that devices are really expanding. There's so many devices, and maybe that's what your job is going to be, is to developing new devices for use in healthcare industry. In 4 years' time, in one hospital setting, there was a growth of 23% of the types of devices, okay? 23% in 4 years' time. So all these devices require training and mastery. They require maintenance and all the other involvements in terms of just trying to keep on top of it all. And that doesn't even include the fact that there are multiple brands that do the same thing, different models. You know, there's constant software revisions. How do we keep up with the training every time a software revision comes along? It's very difficult. Not only that, but we get more complexity because the salespeople, they introduce more features to get more sales. And the clinicians say, we want this device to do yet another chore. So what you have is a tremendous growth in the kinds and types and requirements of mastering these devices. So you can imagine that in itself induces risk. You know, this next slide here, excuse me, sorry, this slide is rather complicated. It's not anything that nurses or clinicians have to deal with. Below the blue line there is the hospital backbone, and above it shows a block diagram of all the parts needed to provide nurses with a phone system that can enable them to hear the clinical alarms and the nurse physiological alarms, the nurse call alarms. So when they're trying to attend to multiple patients, they can keep on top of what's the most difficult thing. Well, you can see it's a bit of a complex problem for the clinical engineers to map all this, put it together, to make constant changes in requests from nursing. But the nurses, there's 60 pages. The slideware for nurses to learn how to use these phones is 60 pages, and there's differences between the units. So again, introduce a new device every time, it introduces more complexities. The next slide, along the same lines, this is just a hospital bed. Look at all the different points where you can interact with the hospital bed. And several of them are not just simple controls, but they're menus, navigation to learn. And that hospital bed, when you look at the manual for it, it has 104 distinct warnings, things not to do, and has 106 distinct icons that you have to know to operate it ideally. Well, nurses never even get to see the manuals for their equipment. There's just too much. In fact, the infusion pump manual, the important information is in 180 pages. And get this, there's a physiological manual that has physiological monitor manual that has 800 pages. And on one of the early pages, it says, quote, I quote, "No product-specific training is required for the use of this monitor."
Pete, that's just, can I interject? That's just astounding and frightening, right? Because the reason that user's manual is 160 pages long and that there's 160 icons is from regulatory requirements. And at the same time, we're encouraged to know that regulatory requirements are increasingly, needing proper human factors analysis. But it seems that the two are at odds. Can you help understand? Because, the regulatory science is the cause of and cure to the problem here.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And it's interesting to note, I mean, just like so many other domains, human factors has come late to industrial chemical, late to nuclear, late to medicine. And you're using the words FDA regulation, and that's FDA are regulators. However, there are no, quote, regulations for human factors. There is guidance, okay? They can't really get your arm behind your back and make you do much. The FDA Office of Human Factors is not very well staffed, but they have come along in the last 10 years in terms of developing guidance to make sure, not even to make sure, but to promote the use of human factors. We'll see later, they will require you to do the human factors validation for 16 life-critical kinds of devices. But yeah, the regulation, you're right, Jeff, the regulation world is yet to catch up. And with a discipline like human factors, it's not necessarily well-funded. That there's, you need regulation to kind of help assure that those capabilities are inserted into the development and use of our medical equipment.
Thanks, Pete.
Was that sufficient?
Yeah, very good. Yeah, I hope that, in the future that the kind of regulatory and safety science that we would envision would prohibit a 160-page manual to a remote control, that it would specifically protect against that kind of ineffective documentation.
Right, and it's too bad that the reason that nuclear accident in 3 Mile Island was the reason NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, required use of human factors, but it takes something really very significant to happen in order to stimulate that legislation so that the regulations are in fact developed.
Thank you.
So sure. Imagine with things this complex, think about the training. There's an incredible training burden on the nurses. If you just scan this slide here for a minute, you can see, in the course of a year, 233 activities for our nurses, and all these other things too. You have to learn how, and apart from learning the policies and procedures, you have to learn the device training. And for devices that you don't use much, you need refresher training. Then, if you've got 300 nurses with a turnover rate of 50 a year, then you've got all this training from the way down the bottom of the baseline. So What's difficult too, of course, is that all this training really reduces time for patient care, and for every nurse who's in training, you need another nurse back on the floor. So the costs are, you can imagine how that affects costs. And similarly for the OR surgeons and the techs. So the techs, they've got more than 70 types of devices they have to be able to set up and troubleshoot. Lasers, very complicated microscopes, pumps, any manner of things. Some hospitals have more than 50 types of lasers. You have to be able to master them and know just what they're doing during the rush of a changeover in an OR room. Sometimes the surgeons are prompted to learn how to use devices between cases, because that's when they're the sales guy. And so you'd think that the vendors would have training people, but no, the people who provide the training are the salespeople. So you can imagine that when you're selling a product, you're not that interested in informing others of what the risks are. You want to promote it as highly as you can. Oftentimes, to really learn how to use the device, you need simulation training, of course, again, refresher training, and you need a learning management system in your administration who's going to track all these kinds of things. It is really a tremendous burden just from the logistics of tracking these things. So go down again. Can you see the whole screen? I'm seeing some thumbnails over top of part of it.
It looks pretty good. We see a top row of gray and a bottom row of yellow boxes.
Okay, should be fine. I don't think it hurts this slide too much. We'll check it as we go along. So what do we do as human factors people? Well, you folks are more along the engineering line, of course, and up top you see a very simple overview of what the design phases are. That last one is validation, of course. So, but the important thing here is that for each of these phases in the engineering development cycle, there are activities that human factors people can do. Okay? It doesn't mean that everything has to be done all the time, but we'll talk about some of these. But early on doing a function analysis, who's going to do this task? Is a person or a machine? We can look at legacy systems to see problems that might have been encountered. In the design input part, it's very important to know who your users are going to be, what their features are and characteristics are like, their skills and education, how the interface might be designed. We perform task analysis, failure modes effects analysis, and FTA. We'll talk about them in more detail. The heuristic reviews are something we can do early on in a project, or we can do it even on a product that's already been commercialized. Our heuristic review is the application of rules from a certain domain. So I'm a human factors person. I would use the standards and my knowledge of human factors in design to evaluate your product. It can be done rather quickly at kind of on a larger overview kind of a scale, but to very easily find out if there are issues in terms of how something is packaged and labeled, what the procedures are, how it's designed, what the interface is. It can be a very helpful way to learn quickly. We'll talk a little bit later about usability testing. Now, you really would prefer to do your usability testing, formative usability testing early in the project. You go through different phases of iterative design, and we could start with early design and do some usability testing or heuristic analysis, and with the idea that every time one changes a design to its next gradation, you're learning along the way. And ultimately, when you do this, you're going to reduce the number of iterations you'll need to do in order to get to a design which is meets your engineering goals and is safe and used by other people. Finally, there's a summative usability analysis, and that is to do once you're ready to go to market, which is really what it does is it's a demonstration final test that you have identified risk earlier in your development efforts and that you've learned methods to control those risks so you can bring the product to market. Oops, went the wrong way. Tiny little buttons. The human factors problem with this keyboard. So task analysis. This is a primary tool used in human factors to understand how the elements of a system work together and how best to design. This is a reductionistic or analysis effort as opposed to the synergistic systems kind of look, because we're reducing this down to the discrete steps. We decompose it to discrete steps. And when I say discrete, I'm thinking in each step there's only one verb, like subject, verb, object kind of a thing. And then we define these steps in sequence, and we look at the aspects of those steps, who's performing them, what knowledge and skills do they need, what tools or what information do they need to make decisions. And actually, for each step, you want to define the criteria for task success. So if we were to look at an example of task analysis, and I've kind of ganged things together here a little bit, you might follow a sequence like this. We look at major tasks and what are the conditions of use for those tasks. We break it down to subtasks. We see what are the knowledge and skills, what are the completion criteria, and in the end, what kind of design changes or training or procedures might we want to use. So for this example here, this is an example of planning and administration of a drug called phenylephrine. And the conditions in this scenario may be that it's happening in an emergency. The drug is in a Pyxis, which is a locked, specialized locked cabinet which you open with your fingerprint. You've got to determine what the dose, concentration, and mixing is. Well, those are really like about 4 or 5 subtasks right there, so it's kind of gang things up. But you would document for each of those. What do you need to know how to use the Pyxis machine, the knowledge. You need to know what the drug and the dose and concentration should be for this patient of this weight. You may need to have tools to do the mathematics to determine the concentration, or you may have a reference for other guidelines given other conditions of this patient. You have to know how to label the medication bags, and so on. So then you establish completion criteria. If I'm going to go on to the next subtask, what all do I have to do? What do I have to do to complete this? And then you can infer, again, what the design, procedures, or training are needed to make sure that you're most likely to complete this properly.
Pete, there's a question here. Can you relate human factors design to user experience design? The users here would be clinicians, nurses, doctors, equipment technicians.
Okay, user experience, or UX, it's sometimes called. They're very, very closely together. Human factors, chronologically, is something that developed during World War II when airmen were crashing planes because of people were using unconventional designs, and they were making other human factors guffaws. So the Army at the time, it was Army Air Force, they brought in psychologists and helped them to design better so that we don't have these accidents. In fact, planes are going so fast, if you were going head on towards another plane, you would hit that plane before that signal from your eye got to the back of the cornea and to the proper part of your brain. So these things weren't thought of by engineers. So that's the kind of history of that. Now, user experience does a lot of the same things, does a lot of the same techniques and tools with a little different name, a little different slant. Sometimes they call it ethnographic research instead of task analysis, which I think anthropologists might argue about, are they really doing ethnographic research? But in any case, user experience has become popular as a technique used by people who are working with a lot of commercial products, website designs, things like this, but also medical stuff. User experience sometimes is they really look at which human factors can be, from packaging and receipt of a material all the way down to disposal for environmental safety, things like this. So UX people have a lot of the same skills that human factors people do. They may not be trained in scientific method as we are. Rather, they're trained into specific design criteria and other methods that they learned along the way. So it's a Venn diagram with a lot of crossover in the short, I guess I should say.
I understand. Thank you so much.
Okay, so that's task analysis. Another, I've got 2 computers going here. To go down on one, I have to press the up arrow, and down the other, it's above that, so it's crazy. Human factors stuff again. If you study human factors too long, you'll start to be unhappy with your world when you notice things could be designed so much better.
You're not alone. Psychologists.
Yeah. Okay, failure modes and effects analysis is another important tool that we use. It's really a prospective assessment, looking in the future. It was really designed, my understanding, by reliability engineers. If you had airplane that had 1,000 components to it, you could look at engineering tables and say, what is the probability of each of those pieces of hardware failing? So you're going to look at each of those elements, and you can add that up, and overall you can get a failure rate for the whole plane in terms of the hardware failures, with an indication of what the effect on the flight is going to be. So we identified in healthcare, we look at processes, and we look at actions and the outcomes. We look at the possibility of different failure modes. Again, this perspective, right? So we're brainstorming what hardware might fail and how, what software, what mistake might a human do, what are the sequence, are the steps in the right sequence, et cetera. You look at the implications of all of these changes, and once you list the causes of those failures, you can take actions to eliminate or control them. And eventually, after you make your next iteration in design or produce the product, you can reevaluate the corrective actions to see if in fact they're helpful at all in reducing the risk. So we can get to a little example here. I don't know if you're familiar with the Greek story of Daedalus and Icarus. Daedalus and Icarus, father and son, were trapped in a tower in Greece long, long ago, and they were prisoners, and the father said, look, we've got all these feathers here, and there's also some wax. We can use this wax to put the feathers together and make wings and slip out this window and escape. But he tells his son, don't fly too high because the wax might melt and the wings will come apart. And also don't go too low, because if you do, we'll get moisture from the waves and the water, and then again, the wings will come apart. So in this case, what we're doing is we're trying to identify what are the ways in which these two guys might have crashed when they're trying to make their way out of the tower. So we could construct something like this, where we'll look at what the hazard might be, the cause, the effect, the probability, and how we might prevent it. So you're brainstorming here, it would be your task to think of how many ways might they not succeed and crash into the ocean or into the dirt. And you just start listing them. Thermal radiation from the sun. What's the cause? What's the effect? You can give a quantitative or a qualitative probability, whichever you might be able to. Another hazard, there could be an in-flight encounter, collision with a bird. Okay. Again, you keep going through. They could be struck by a bolt from Zeus. You can think of a million things. So it's that brainstorming activity where you're trying to find any hazard. And you're doing here was really a bottom-up method, aren't you? You're not looking at the top-down, but you're looking at the hazard and see what the effect is, and then how can you control that effect. Fault tree analysis is a little bit different. Okay, fault tree analysis is a top-down or inductive approach. And you use this when the undesired state is known. So you can build a tree. In this case, here's one that has failure to respond to a critical physiological alarm. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to pose that undesired state at the top, like the crashing, of Daedalus and Icarus would be this. If you did a fault tree analysis, it would be the crash, and we'd start from there. And then you start to develop an intermediate level here of events. For instance, well, how many ways can this happen? You failure to respond to alarm. They might not recognize the alarms. You might have insufficient monitor skills. It might be the design of the interface, or equipment failure. It could be any of these kind of things. And you continue on to make a tree. This one differs a little bit. Oop, and again, sorry folks. To make a tree where you have these and or gates. Yeah, and or gates. So the top level here we see unable to differentiate alarm codes on the left. Or below that we've got an OR gate. These are all the different ways that might contribute you to not differentiating an alarm code. Each of them you might consider to be a root cause failure. So in this case, we're building a downward tree. And again, the object is to identify in each of these circles a hazard or a cause of failure that, again, you can try to control, eliminate, or control. And we'll talk about means to eliminate or control these hazards in just a little bit. Not learning very quickly, am I? I wanted you to know, too, that human factors people also do research. This is an example of a joint project by Hopkins Hospital, myself, and APL, Hopkins APL. It's a prototype for design for an infusion pump. Now, what we were interested in doing was, one, coming up with a better interface for a design for an infusion pump to deliver medications, and also to test what's the safety benefit of using barcoding on patients and on drug bottles and things like this when we actually administer those drugs? Well, we worked together to design this new interface. We conducted a simulation with sim bodies, and with nurses came in, we had them go through different scenarios. We didn't find any differences in the barcode versus the non-barcode instance, but what was very interesting is that we identified that, and this is a problem common to a lot of instances, is when you automate things, people aren't watching as closely what happens. So experienced nurses were saying, when this is automated, because of the barcode, I trust the barcoding, and there are cases where I know aspects about the patient that the system doesn't know, and I should be overviewing, interrupting, interacting in those conditions. If we just trust the automated system too well, we can end up with a bad event. And as you may know, it does happen. It happens in aviation too. I know there was a case of 2 pilots fell asleep on the way to LA and went at least an hour out into the Pacific Ocean before they were awakened and had enough fuel to come back. But there are many aspects of automated systems that human factors people do research. Let's see, I'm getting out of place here. Sorry. There's been research done. Oh, that's too bad. We can't. This is hiding the numbers. I wish I could slide this over. I didn't realize this. I thought this was going to be off to the side. But
we can see the numbers, Pete.
Can you?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just seeing you guys. So, all right, good. So this is research for generalized human error rates. You can see in these different conditions, there's different probabilities shown in the right column of failure. And of course, this doesn't apply to any specific task. This is data collected over many different types of tasks and rolled up in a cumulative way to come up with estimates of error rates. So, look at the general rate involving high stress is 0.3 versus limit of human performance. This can help you give an idea of the expectations you might have in people's performance and how it might be important to work together in teams or to install other kinds of controls. There are environmental issues. I wanted to discuss the space issues and other environment. Your hospital noise limits here, that's the World Health Organization. Those noise limits in hospitals, they're impossible to achieve. I mean, they're respectful, but it's impossible. So lighting, temperature, humidity, all these things are important. I did work in yes.
Well,
Sam, can you want to ask your question? I'm not sure exactly what it is.
Sure thing. Yeah, just I actually have come into Hopkins and biomedical innovation from a more social science and actually anthropology background. So it's interesting to see these factors accounted for. They're very qualitative and sort of narrative in nature. And I just wonder about ways that these things are turned into something quantitative where you could have a composite score to measure various versions of a design for something where it would be technology relevant at least. So you're comparing planes to planes and saying overall this had a human factor score of 86 versus 94 for another design or something. Is there something like that?
Yeah, wouldn't that be nice? It's very difficult. To do that, you would need an exceptionally large number of participants or subjects in many, many conditions. So it's the quantitative bits are really rather elusive, is what I wanted to say. What we can do is to run testing and look for errors, correct the designs, and then improve the design. It's what you're asking has been a big problem for human factors people all along. We've been accused of coming along and hanging the black crepe and just complaining about systems without having sufficient data to demonstrate that things had to be changed. And it's an understandable argument because sometimes the expense to make changes is great, and it's very difficult to make the trade-offs of what changes are worthwhile and which are not. I'm sorry, I don't have an answer. I wish I could say how that might be done. Same thing as a return on investment kind of issues. Similar, demonstrate to me the value for return on investment. And even the marketing people, maybe you guys know better than I do, but I've learned at TEDCO and other places that you don't want to really try to go the ROI argument that other sales opportunities or approaches work better, if I'm not correct. That's what I've heard. So yeah, it's very difficult to justify based on quantitative or ROI information.
Thank you.
I wish I had a better answer for you. You know, some cases are really highly unusual, so it's hard to tell. This picture here is a case in point. This is, I worked at this nuclear plant back in the early 80s. There's 2 units. You can see 2 reactors there with domes over them. Unit 1, Unit 2. Well, a tech was sent down to turn off the reactor coolant pump on Unit 1. And he went down the stairwell and he turned right into the Unit 2 side. And went over to the pump and looked at the pump. The pump had a label and it said Unit 1. So he shut down the pump. He said, wait a minute, I'm not on Unit 1 side. Why does this say Unit 1? So I know I'm on Unit 2. So he turned that pump back on. Well, the pumps pump hundreds of thousands of gallons of water a minute into the reactor coolant system. And you can't stop and start a pump like that with that much head on it. And it wiped and ruined the pump. These pumps are 3 stories tall. You have to be removed and recertified. So the total losses was like $73 million in terms of replacing the pump and the lost revenue because somebody turned the wrong direction at the bottom of the stairs, and because that switch had been removed from Unit 1 when it broke, put in the spares bin, fixed, put in the spares bin, and when they needed something for Unit 2, they put it over there without changing the label. So you see the implications for the, who would ever expect that those conditions would come together? So to try to provide guidance or convince someone that you need to take the appropriate measures to prevent that would be a hard sell. So once you have identified these risks, what we need to do now is to classify them according to their probability of occurrence and their severity. And you could use a scheme like this. This is from the military work and adapted into the risk management standards for healthcare. So we have different probabilities. Again, per your question, Sam, this is shown as being frequent, improbable. It's all qualitative. Now, you could, in some cases, you might be able to define where it says continuously experienced. Well, that's a 1, probability of 1, right? But if you can assign probabilities in those columns, you can get much better quantitative data to work with. But that's not frequently found. Similarly, with the severity, you can define these conditions for catastrophic death or permanent total disability. And what we want to do here is combine these two to come up with a risk hazard index. And we come up with this risk hazard index, we can assign these things as to importance in terms of the hazard. If you have a 1A, that's catastrophic, someone will likely die, or critical. And you can build a scheme like this where we might say, it's most important to address all these boxes in the red, okay? Next important is the yellow. So we're going to apply our resources to take care of those 1A, 2A, 3A, et cetera, 1Cs first. And those you might want to use a stricter means of controlling them, like really a design thing, not relying on training or procedures, but a design. Okay. Are we really at 46 minutes in? I don't think so.
Yeah, we are.
Let's do, yeah, we have 10 minutes remaining.
Okay, so that's the gist for there. What I want to get to is this is important, the ways to control risk. First, design it. Okay, like this forcing function here. This is for a bed cable, and you can't plug this cable in wrong, so you won't miss a bed alarm when somebody gets out of bed when they shouldn't. Okay? Incorporating safety devices. You can have an interlock on a door in a panel which has a lot of power in it. When you open the door, the power is removed. Warning and safety devices, and finally development procedures. These are in order of importance. The more hazardous, the more important it is to do a 1 versus a 2 versus a 3. If you have too many warnings, like this device, which rotates a patient for spinal surgery, these are warning devices. The whole table rotates, so you go from supine to prone. If the patient isn't secure and you rotate, the patient falls on the floor. Well, the warnings by themselves didn't work the job. They had to change it with a design requirement so that you couldn't rotate it in the wrong conditions. There are means to control risk through training. I'm not going to take a lot of time on this slide since we have such little time left, but there are specific means to do that. Training is not just something you do offhandedly. There are specific methods to use. What you really are interested in here is this FDA activity or guidance. They want you to use these human factors methods to control risks, specifically these kind of risks. Okay, so the things we talked about, failure modes, effects analysis, fault tree analysis, task analysis, assessing, categorizing these risks. This is what FDA is asking you to do, and they're asking you to do it for 16 specific devices which are life critical. Other cases on a case by case, or if there's something that could result in serious harm. So you can look at FDA guidance, usability or FDA guidance, human factors, and you'll find the guidance that they're providing in their .gov site. And they're asking you to do these things, as I said, identify the known problems, use a heuristic review, of course, or observe the device in use, do these formative evaluations, which is usability testing. Okay? You want to eliminate or control these hazards. After you've done all your work, you validate your work. When you really think you're ready to go, you check it again, you do usability testing again, which we'll talk about, but you're identifying the problems, you're addressing these residual risks, and then you've got to document this in a report for the FDA. Here's a usability test I did at Hopkins. We looked at 3 different infusion pumps with 25 participants. They all did the same scenario. They all worked on the same pumps, and we found what's the safest pump. So we go in, what we do is, it's important to, let's see, what's my list here? You want to develop your test objectives in your plan. You've got to identify the users, the types of users that are using this equipment. You've got to conduct your test with your specific criteria for success and go through a formal test. It's also described in the FDA guidance. There are metrics for the usability. You can see some of them here. It's not just how many complete the task or not, but you can look at a lot of things to improve a lot of aspects of your device. Okay, look at the types of errors. How do you recover from errors? What's the time to train? What features are not used? Do you really need them? So we do have a set of standards for design. Okay, this human factor standards is from AMI. That's the Association for the Advancement of Medical Instrumentation. Okay, and it's a large document that has a lot of different sections on display design, interface, audibility, alarms, the whole everything. There are alarm standards from the IEC, and of course there are risk management standards from AMI as well. There are a lot of aspects of your tools design that are important to have. I'm showing just a couple here. You can look at the text, but this little picture down the bottom is a cardiac pacemaker, and if you hit the buttons in the right sequence, it just stops, and it gives you this error 0004 message, and you don't know what to do. And it's a pacemaker, right? You have to know that you open the battery door, turn it back, pull the battery off, put it back in place, and start again. So that's not acceptable. The control on the right just shows a bad instance of mental mapping. We call mental mapping. If you look at that, this is my HVAC or my ventilation device. If I want the fan to blow on the floor, I have to point the pointer down where it blows. Oh, I'm sorry. when I want the fan to blow up, I have to point the pointer down. If I want the fan to blow down on my feet, I have to put the pointer up, so it's a 180 out. Wouldn't it be nicer if I didn't have to look at this when I was driving? You could just know that up means up, down means down. That's a simple example, but there are many, many examples where this kind of effort can be, or concept can be used. Here's design inconsistency when this is the same infusion pump. When the cursor is under a number in one case, it adds a number to the right on your next entry. In another case, it erases the number under the cursor and substitutes whatever you're entering now. So it's surprising how many of these things you can find when you start looking very closely. In the end, then, human factors we can contribute to make things easy to learn, of course, easy navigation, efficient and satisfying. It's important when people get lost that they be able to find their way back. They're really not stuck. It's really disconcerting when you hear a surgeon calling for help because they're using a device and they're lost with the device in a critical moment. Forcing functions, of course, reduce the need for training, which is something we need to do all around, is reduce the training burden because people aren't getting trained enough because there's too much training to go on, and you can't train everything on the job training. So if you guys are able to develop devices which preclude the need for a lot of training, it'll be more saleable, it'll be better, it'll be safer. So I have some references there that Dr. Montague will have this information. There's a number of resources he'll have available. Other than that, I'll say thank you. And how are we on time? We are like 53 minutes, I think.
Very good, Pete. Thank you so much. Resounding applause from the gallery.
Sorry, it was a rush.
Possibly in the shape of emoji. Thank you, Pete.
Certainly.
Well, questions from the audience? You can unmute and ask your questions.
The infusion pump design is a great example of usability, but also ways where designers have just got it wrong. And you were touching on classic examples there at the end of just inconsistencies and also units, right? Like English standard versus metric units, or millimeters versus centimeters, and things like that. And some of these, the outcome is, unfortunately, can be deadly.
Absolutely, it's heart-rending when you find this out and you look into it, after the fact, and are looking into finding things that appear to be so simple, and that people overcome them because of their resilience a lot. But the objective is to design systems which are highly reliable in the first place.
Yeah. High reliability systems. So Pete, could you reflect a little bit on where are we relative to maybe 20 years ago, when medicine looked to the airline industry as a place where safety science and high reliability systems were sort of recognized, I suppose, and coming up to speed. And medicine looked to aeronautics as an example. Where are we relative to that now? Because in the last 5 years, aeronautics hasn't had such a sterling set of examples, despite their really solid work in human factors and safety science. You end up with some pretty terrible counterexamples. Has medicine progressed and is now, what is the relationship now between medicine and other places where human factors and safety science are very strong?
One of the big differences when you compare medicine to other, like military or aviation, medicine is high production. Soldiers train, and maybe someday they have to fight. Aviation, they dedicate the resources. They've got financial to dedicate resources for training, and they've got that long history of use of safety. It's the public's concept of what's safe to do and what's not, is interesting. I mean, it's scary to fly, scary to be off the ground, but I have faith in a doctor. But it's certainly we read different results in compared to what Dr. McCary says about. Some argue that the failure rates in medicine are much higher than we used to think in 1999. It's really hard. Dr. Peter Pronovost says that we're not getting any better. To compare us to the other organizations, even Boeing has kind of fallen down lately, because you can see any inclusion of methods or dedication of allocation and dedication of resources within a domain. It can vary like a pendulum. Boeing kind of slipped a little bit recently. Yeah. So it's difficult to say, and there's always these competing resources to get the allocation and allocate the resources to make sure that safety is there, and it's challenging in medicine now for a number of reasons. So I'm not sure that we're making a lot of progress. I don't know. When I came into medicine in 2007, not many other hospitals had a human factors person, and I don't think, well, a number have since, but I don't know. I suspect that most still do not, and it takes more than one person to do all the work. And the the institution has to be amenable to making the changes.
And NASA continues to amaze, by the way. They're on a roll. They keep doing it right. They're, you know, high reliability systems landing on Mars. You know, NASA, you know, when it goes wrong, it goes wrong in a really expensive way, but they seem to be doing it quite well lately.
Absolutely. One might say that they have control of their schedule to some point. I mean, they're time stressed, but not the same as a surgeon who just accidentally cut an artery to a kidney.
For some of the innovators who are here, you know, and they're at various stages in their development, maybe they're seeing a device forward to IRB or IDE, or maybe they're working with a startup and they're kind of entering into a regulatory process. Is human factors in the would be nice category, or can you comment a little more on where someone is really seeing some technology forward in commercialization and regulatory? What is absolutely essential from a human factors perspective? Is it usability testing? What is it that's really required if you're going to take these things clinical and commercial? What do you need to do?
Yeah. So the most important thing is to identify critical tasks and have the perspective to know what the critical hazards are. Sometimes, depending on the complexity of the device, sometimes it's evident to engineers. Many times it is not. So that's the benefit of this expert review or heuristic review we talk about, is that, for a very little bit of effort, one can help a developer along the ways to reduce the number of iterations that might be necessary and achieve the goals. But it's all dependent on the complexity of the equipment. You can save time too if you're developing the procedures, or in FDA, of course, calls it labeling. You want to put a product to market. The labeling aspect can hold you up many months. So getting some perspective from someone else who's knowledgeable in procedures and what their expectations are at the FDA can save you a lot of time for relatively little bit of effort or resources. So it's naturally dependent on the device that's being developed. But again, as we saw with the FDA guidance, identify the critical hazards and control them. Make sure there's little residual left and all residual risk left when we're all said and done.
We have time for one more question from Chen, and if you could unmute and ask that. I also have posted the survey in the chat, so please take just 2 minutes to fill that out. It will help us evaluate it. So Chen, the last question is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is a very insightful presentation, so thanks very much. I have a question that might be similar as the one that Sam has asked. So I'm just wondering, do we have any kind of standardized and validated measures before and after we introducing a medical device? As you have mentioned, we have those kind of usability metrics. So I just wonder if we have a recommended list of this kind of standardized usability metrics, and where can we find them? Thank you.
Where can we find the metrics to perform usability testing? Did I understand, or was it more along the lines of how do we know?
More general, because I see some terms as satisfaction and adherence terms. So I just wonder what type of measures or metrics we usually use and get validated.
Okay, specific tools to measure those things. Yeah. There's an interesting one. It's free, it's from the government, and it's kind of oriented towards computer work, but nevertheless, it's a really good start of 10 questions called System Usability Scale. You can find it at .gov, System Usability Scale. And that's basically 10 questions for your user to answer, to give indications. And, it's the relationship of usability to safety is a little bit loose, maybe, just because it's usable doesn't mean it's safe. So again, I was thinking the first part of your question, maybe your best metric really is once you've done that risk hazard index of all your hazards, And when you finish that and you look at your residual risk, that's your best final indication of your degree of success.
Thank you.
Certainly.